Welcome back to the Unseen Wisdom, where we, kind of dig through the news, trying to find the stories behind the headlines. And don't forget to like and comment and subscribe and all that good stuff so you can join us for future deep dives. And today we are focusing on a story that I think is weighing on everyone's minds, and that is the South African soldiers who died tragically in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And specifically, we're looking at the fact that there have been no updates on their return. So, will President Ramaphosa address this during his State of the Nation address tonight?
Well, it's a really crucial question, and to understand why this repatriation has been so full of delays, and what it might tell us about the situation in the DRC, we're going to have to unpack a lot of complex issues.
Okay, so can you kind of paint the picture for us?
Yeah.
What is the status of the repatriation right now?
Sure. So the SANDF, the South African National Defense Force, initially announced that the soldiers would be returned on February 5th.
Okay.
And that information came directly from a briefing session in Parliament. But there was a statement from the SANDF a little bit later that said that there was going to be a delay, and that the delay was because of administrative processes with the UN, and then because the UN is having trouble moving the deceased out of the conflict zone. But, and I think this is really important, they haven't given us a new timeline, which of course is, making everybody anxious.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's got to be just agonizing for those families who've been waiting for weeks now with no clear indication of when they can finally, lay their loved ones to rest.
Absolutely. And, some family members have been really brave and shared their stories.
Right.
And it's really heartbreaking. Like one mother talked about how happy she was when her son called and said that he would be home soon. And then, she's just been thrown into this horrible limbo.
Oh.
And Lindy Zulu, she's the former Minister of Social Development. She's been very vocal about saying that the government really needs to be transparent and, put those families first.
And Zulu is someone who really understands these situations right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she does. Her experience, makes her concerns have more weight.
Yeah.
And she's also said that she thinks that President Ramaphosa is going to have to address this in his SONA tonight.
Oh, really?
Yeah, ignoring it would be, not just politically bad, but morally untenable, I think, with, the whole nation grieving.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's talk about some of the reasons that this might be delayed.
Okay.
The news mentions the fact that Goma is very unstable right now.
Right.
And that's where the soldiers were stationed. So how much of a factor is that, do you think?
It's a huge factor. Goma is mostly controlled by the M23 rebels.
Right.
And that makes it a very dangerous and complicated place to try to get the bodies back from. The SANDF has to be sure that everyone involved in this repatriation is going to be safe, and if they rush it, they could be putting even more lives at risk.
So it's not just about paperwork and logistics. It's about, navigating an active war zone.
Exactly, and that's why the M23 rebels are such an important part of this whole thing. If we want to understand what is going on in Goma and what that means for bringing those soldiers home, then we have to understand their history and what they're trying to do.
Okay, so who are these M23 rebels? What do they want?
So the M23 have been around for a long time in the DRC. Their history goes back to 2012. Basically, they're a rebel group that's mostly made up of Congolese Tutsis who mutinied from the National Army.
Mm.
They say that they have problems with the government. The name March 23 movement comes from a peace agreement that was signed on that date that didn't work out.
Oh, so their main problem is with the DRC government and not really with South Africa or the UN forces?
That's right. But they're there, and that creates a lot of complicated relationships and tension, And that obviously has an effect on the peacekeeping mission and this repatriation. They've been accused of getting support from Rwanda, which is the country next door. But Rwanda's president, his name is Paul Kagame, he denies this very strongly. However, MONUSCO, which is the UN peacekeeping mission in the DRC, they've confirmed that there are Rwandan troops there.
Wait a minute. MONUSCO has actually seen Rwandan troops, but that directly contradicts what Kagame is saying.
Yeah, it does. But we have to remember that it's hard for MONUSCO to monitor what is going on there because of all the fighting.
Right.
They've said that their movement is restricted, so it's really hard for them to get, really clear evidence. So we've got these two different stories, and we have to figure out who to believe and think about, if they might be biased, and just realize that we may not know the whole truth right now.
It's like trying to see through this fog of war where information is all messed up and everybody's disagreeing.
That's a good way to put it. But these conflicting reports could mean big things. If it turns out that Rwanda is involved, then things could get really bad. Other countries might get dragged into the conflict, and the violence could get worse and, just make an already volatile situation that much harder to solve.
And that would make the SANDF's job even harder, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they're not just trying to, bring bodies home. They're dealing with this very delicate geopolitical situation.
Exactly. They have to think about not just getting the soldiers home, but also how their actions are going to affect the stability of the whole region. It's a very tough balancing act. They have to think very carefully about all different groups involved and, all their competing interests.
So we've got the M23 in control of Goma accusations about Rwanda being involved and a
Yeah.
UN mission that can't really do its job very well. So how does all of this actually affect the repatriation?
Well, just imagine trying to plan something as sensitive as this in a city that's controlled by a group that doesn't trust anyone from the outside, especially people who are seen as being connected to the DRC government.
Right.
And then you add in the possibility of foreign troops and the fact that the UN peacekeeping force can't really move around freely. And you can see how something that should be relatively straightforward in terms of logistics becomes incredibly complicated.
So it's not as simple as sending a helicopter in to pick up the bodies.
Not at all.
It's this really sensitive operation where they have to negotiate and worry about security, and things could go wrong very quickly.
You got it. Every single move has to be planned very carefully.
Yeah.
And every interaction is potentially, full of tension. And that all takes time.
And that brings us back to the question we started with. Will President Ramaphosa talk about this in his SONA tonight?
I think he has to. This has become something that everybody in the country is paying attention to. The families deserve some answers, and the public wants transparency, and the president needs to show that his government is in control and, doing what's best for those soldiers who died and for the peace effort in general.
Yeah, if he ignores it, it would be like he's saying that the sacrifice of these soldiers doesn't matter.
Exactly. It would send the wrong message to people here and in other countries.
So we'll be watching very closely tonight to see how he deals with this very delicate and complicated issue. Now, before we dive into, the possible political fallout from this whole situation, let's take a quick look at
And we are back, and we are continuing our deep dive into this delay in getting those South African soldiers back from the DRC. And of course, everybody's wondering if President Ramaphosa is going to mention this during his State of the Nation address.
Before we moved on, you're talking about how sensitive this whole thing is, like getting those soldiers' remains out of this city that is controlled by rebels and maybe even foreign actors. It really shows you how complex these peacekeeping missions are.
Oh, absolutely. It's easy to just think, oh, you're sending in troops to, keep things under control. But this situation really shows us that it is a lot more complicated than that. It involves diplomacy and logistics and political stuff. And then, of course, the fact that the people who are there on the ground are always in danger.
And the danger is even greater in this case because the M23 is controlling Goma. I mean, if you look at their history in this region, it doesn't seem very likely that they're just going to cooperate with the SANDF or the UN.
You are right to bring that up because the M23's motivations are really key to understanding, why this is so hard. They believe that they are fighting for the rights of Congolese Tutsis who they think the government is treating badly.
Right.
And on top of that, they've been accused of, human rights abuses and war crimes.
Oh, wow.
So that adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing.
So even if the SANDF could get into Goma, safely negotiating with a group like the M23 with their own agenda and possibly very unstable leaders has got to be incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I mean, just try to imagine trying to build trust and, find common ground with a group who thinks that you are on the side of the government that they're fighting. It's like walking a tightrope diplomatically.
And then we have the question of, is Rwanda involved? If they are, like MONUSCO says, then it just adds another layer of geopolitical intrigue. So what could happen if it's confirmed that Rwanda is involved?
Well, if they can prove that Rwanda is involved, it could make the whole region unstable.
Wow.
You could see other countries getting pulled into the conflict, and then the violence could get even worse, and it would just make everything so much harder to resolve peacefully.
It's like a domino effect where each piece makes everything else more unstable. It makes you wonder how this is going to affect South Africa's role in this peacekeeping mission.
That's a really important question. South Africa has been a major contributor to the peacekeeping efforts in the DRC, but this whole situation is really putting them in a tough spot. They have to get their soldiers home, but they also have to deal with all these different actors locally and in the region, and they have to, uphold their commitment to the UN mission.
That is a lot to deal with, and it makes you wonder how effective these peacekeeping missions can really be in such a crazy environment.
Yeah, and it's even worse because MONUSCO, the UN peacekeeping force, is facing restrictions and security problems themselves. They have said that they have limited capacity to do their job, which makes you wonder how well they can really monitor what's going on, protect civilians, and, try to get a peaceful solution.
So we've got this situation where the SANDF wants to get their soldiers out. The M23 is controlling the area.
Yeah.
There are these accusations that another country is involved and the UN peacekeeping force can't really do what it's supposed to do. It sounds like there's no way out.
It's definitely a tough situation with no easy answers. And remember, all this is happening while President Ramaphosa is getting ready to give his State of the Nation address tonight. It's hard to imagine that he's not going to talk about this because, there's so much pressure on him and people are so upset about this.
He's in a very difficult position. I mean, he has to acknowledge that this is a very serious situation, and he has to try to reassure the families who are grieving. But at the same time, he can't look like he's losing control or that he's putting the mission in danger by saying too much.
Exactly. You're right. It's a delicate balancing act. He has to sound empathetic and resolute, and he has to make it clear that he's committed to finding a solution. But at the same time, the situation is still developing.
And it's also important to remember that this delay in getting the soldiers back and the whole conflict in the DRC is having a real effect on humanitarian efforts in the area.
Yeah.
I mean, the fighting and the fact that it's hard to move around is making it very difficult for aid organizations to reach people who need help.
That is a very important point. The human cost of this conflict is a lot more than just the soldiers who died.
Right.
There are thousands of civilians who are caught in the middle of this, and they've been forced to leave their homes, and they don't have enough food, and they're getting sick.
And it sounds like the organizations that are trying to help them, like the International Organization for Migration, are having their own problems. I remember reading something about them having funding issues that are affecting their work.
Yeah. The stop work order, because of those problems with U.S. aid funding, is a big blow to humanitarian efforts. It just goes to show you that these conflicts have effects that go way beyond the fighting itself. They affect a lot of innocent people.
So while we're focusing on, the politics and the delay in getting the soldiers back, it's important to remember the people who are suffering because of this. This is about real people whose lives have been turned upside down and their needs are just as important as any political concerns.
Absolutely. And we need to keep that in mind as we listen to what the president has to say tonight. Will he mention the civilians who are suffering? Will he offer any real solutions to the humanitarian crisis?
Those are definitely questions we'll be listening for. Now, before we move on to analyze, the possible political fallout from all of this, let's take a moment to.
Okay, and we are back for our final part of this deep dive, looking into the delay in getting those soldiers back from the DRC and that whole conflict. And of course, we have President Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address that's happening tonight. We have talked about a lot of stuff from, how hard it's going to be to actually get those soldiers back to, the bigger picture, like what's going on in the region and the humanitarian crisis.
Yeah, it's a situation where it seems like everything is connected. Everything we talk about just leads to more and more complexity. And we talked about the problems that the SANDF is facing and what the M23 wants, and those allegations about Rwanda and how this is affecting humanitarian efforts.
And all of this is happening while, everyone in the political world is watching very closely. Tonight's Sona is going to be very intense, I think. So what are some of the key things you're going to be listening for when he gives his speech? Well, the first thing is, of course, is he going to talk about this delay in getting those soldiers back? Will he acknowledge that the families are suffering? And will he give us any real updates about when this might happen or what the problems are?
I mean, if he doesn't talk about it, that would be a huge mistake.
Yeah.
The whole country is grieving, and they're looking to him for reassurance and for a plan.
Absolutely. And beyond that, I'll be listening to how he puts this whole thing into the context of South Africa's role in the DRC. Will he talk about how committed they are to peacekeeping? Will he talk about those accusations against Rwanda? And will he offer any solutions to the violence that's happening there and the humanitarian crisis?
I also want to see how he, manages to maintain good relationships with the countries in the region while still protecting South Africa's interests. This situation could really damage relationships with neighboring countries, especially if it turns out that Rwanda is involved.
Yeah, and everyone is going to be listening very carefully to his words, both here and in other countries. He has to sound strong and like a leader, but he also has to show that he understands how complicated this whole thing is.
This is a really important speech. This delay in getting the soldiers back has become a symbol of all these bigger problems that South Africa is facing, like the conflict in the DRC and the humanitarian crisis and the pressure to, take care of things at home while also keeping its promises to the international community.
It's like this microcosm of the really complicated realities of peacekeeping and international relations. There are no easy answers and no quick fixes. It takes a really nuanced approach. You have to think about the needs of everyone involved, from the families of those soldiers to the whole international community.
So as we finish up this deep dive, what is the main thing you want our listeners to take away from this?
I think the most important thing is to remember that real people are suffering because of this conflict. We talked about the soldiers who died and the families who are grieving and all those civilians who are caught in the middle of all this. Their stories need to be heard, and their needs have to come first.
It's easy to get caught up in all the politics and strategy, but at the end of the day, this is about people's lives.
And we need to remember that these conflicts have consequences that go way beyond the battlefield. They affect families and communities and entire regions. Leaders make decisions that have a huge impact, and we as citizens have a responsibility to hold them accountable.
Well said. This deep dive has really been a journey into the hidden complexities of a situation that, on the surface might seem simple. But as we've seen, there are all these political and logistical and humanitarian challenges involved.
And the story isn't over yet. We're going to keep following this, and we'll talk about it more as things develop.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the repatriation delay and the conflict in the DRC and what all this means for President Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address. We hope you'll keep looking into these issues, seek out different points of view and engage in thoughtful discussions. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.